Good morning, everyone. I'm going to call this special meeting of the Assembly's Committee on Housing and Homelessness to order. Travis, can you please call the roll?
Yes. Ms. Allard? Mr. Constant? Here. Mr. Dunbar? Here. Ms. Kennedy? Ms. LaFrance? Mr. Perez-Verdia? Mr. Peterson? Present. Mr. Rivera? Present. Mr. Littleton? Here. Ms. Salvatell?
Here. Thank you. So the format for today's meeting, we are streaming on Facebook Live via the Municipal Clerk's Facebook page. The PowerPoint we'll be seeing today is on the committee's website, particularly those who might be joining on Facebook or via phone. And it looks like we've been joined by Ms. Kennedy and Ms. LaFrance. So with that, we're going to get to our single item of business. I'd like to welcome up Mayor-elect Bronson to say a few words and kick off our presentation. Welcome, Mayor-elect.
Good morning, Anchorage and the Anchorage Assembly.
I'm sorry, can you press the yellow taped and then again, and once the red light on the microphone is on, you are live.
Madam Chair, one other thing, I would note that Ms. LaFrance and Ms. Kennedy are.
Thank you. There we go. Please, Mayor-elect.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Good morning, Anchorage and the Anchorage Assembly. I appreciate this opportunity. I have just a few comments and I'll introduce Dr. Morris. Today we are here to announce the next step for addressing homelessness in Anchorage. These complex areas have received significant attention in recent months and rightly so. Today I'm here to present a blueprint and plan to tackle this issue in a way that is practical, compassionate, and outcome-based. This plan represents months of engagement and work with stakeholders, community partners across the municipality. It represents a real, concerted effort to build upon the foundation that has been laid in this space over many years to finally take the next steps in addressing homelessness. We look forward to working with the residents of Anchorage and the Assembly to move this plan forward. Our plan is based on the idea that we must provide adequate shelter to the unhoused populations of Anchorage. This is critical not only to provide for the needs of the unhoused, but a necessary step in order to clean up our streets, abate camps, and make our public spaces safer for Anchorage families. Our plan proposes the construction of a purpose-built navigation center that will be strategically placed in Anchorage. We have reviewed examples of structures across the country in locations such as San Francisco, Reno, and Houston. Our plan has identified a location near the corner of Elmore and Tudor, near the existing site of the former Anchorage Police Department headquarters. This location is strategically located near medical service providers as well as law enforcement. This will be a hardened structure with concrete floors, bathrooms, heating, cafeteria, medical facilities, rehabilitation, job services, and more. Our plan will provide emergency bed space for the Anchorage homeless population, and it will do so on an accelerated timetable to meet the needs of our community and the urgency created by the closing of the Sullivan Arena. We hope to break ground this summer and be able to provide shelter and services sometime early in the fall. Our plan will also provide necessary capacities and work with stakeholders to provide wraparound services for a meaningful transition for the Anchorage homeless. Again, this plan is not a solution to homelessness. It is simply the next step to addressing these issues with our partners while we work towards a permanent solution. But as citizens of Anchorage, have demanded, while we address these issues with compassion, we must also work to make our streets and communities a cleaner, safer place to live, work, and play. We have a moral obligation to fix these issues. The economic and social consequences are far too great if we don't take back control of our city. This is why it is incumbent upon all of us to come together to work hand in hand and find solutions to some of the greatest issues impacting our community. I'd like now to introduce Dr. John Morris, our transition team leader, and he will walk you through the preliminary plan. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mayor-elect. For members, if you'd like to get in the queue, just either text me or raise your hand. We've been joined by Member Perez Ferdia, and then we're going to hold all questions during this presentation until the end. All right, welcome, Dr. Morris. And the clerk's office here will bring up the presentation.
Morning, thank you. Appreciate the introduction, Mr. Thompson. Forgive me, I'll get used to the microphone. We think of this as taking the next steps. We're very conscious of the frank successes that we've had here, particularly over the past few years as a city, with many stakeholders, and frankly, including the Assembly. And we don't believe that we're inventing something new. We think that we're taking the next logical step in progression of good, positive steps forward to help our unhoused neighbors. I'd like to talk about first the process and then how we came to this plan itself, compare the plan to some other ideas that are out there, and then talk about, if we still have time, forgive me, what we want to do as next steps. We absolutely don't believe that this shelter is the end. It's simply the next step, and there are several more necessary things to do. So as for the process, every organization or person on this screen has two things in common. One, they have a logo. I can download it off the internet. And two, there's someone or something, or an organization that I've learned something from, and we've learned something from as we've gone through this process. And let me stress, there's absolutely no daylight between Mayor Bronson and myself using these issues. But I started on this road before I ever met Mr. Bronson. My wife and I realized that this is where we're going to make our home. We wanted to make a contribution to it. And we said that, what's the biggest problem, frankly, we felt facing the town, and that's homelessness. And so we started visiting with homeless service providers and asking, two simple questions. What is it that's going good for you now, and what can we do to help you? And a lot of them asked us to meet mayoral candidates, not just Mr. Bronson. And it was through that process that we met Mr. Bronson and were delighted with his views and compassion on this issue. So, why have a centralized navigation center? And I'm going to come back to that term. We talk about it being a shelter. That's actually not the intention. The correct, accurate term is navigation center. I'm sorry about the microphone. I'm doing my best. It's just a lot of folks behind me. I'm not sure what's polite. So when we're looking at what we want to do for the city, we thought it was pretty reasonable to start off with the published strategy that the city already has. And this is the last year of schedule for this edition of Anchorage Home. And it's got 4 big pillars. And we noticed that public health and safety is a pillar. And it's sort of assigned to the municipality of Anchorage. It doesn't mean the municipality of Anchorage is the only one involved, but I interpret that to mean that according to Anchorage Home, the municipality should take a lead in that. And we absolutely agree with that, the plan. So digging down into the plan, sorry for the busy slide. Bryce, the guy who actually knows about PowerPoint, did his best, but I'm afraid I didn't get him much to work with. This is full text from the Anchorage Home plan. Action item number 1 for the municipality of Anchorage. Assess capacity and demand for emergency shelter, transitional housing. Skip a little bit. Supports needed to make camping in public spaces unnecessary. Action item number 2, stabilize and maintain citywide safety net services, including adequate emergency shelter for all seeking shelter. Third, identify adequate and long-term cold weather shelter during the winter months. We agree with all of that. Going in a little further action items, which are other components of our immediate first step plan, Talk about outreach. Increase camp and street outreach and provide mobile assessments for coordinated entry system. And what do we mean by outreach? We mean engaging people and letting them know that there's another choice and we feel it's a better choice. Okay? And budget and establish policies for rapid and efficient year-round notice, abasement, and cleanup of unauthorized camps. We agree with that too. A little further. It's also common sense that the municipality should own health and safety. Municipality provides fire truck, the ambulance, police, the safety patrol. We're used to that. It makes sense. It's effective. And those are not functions that we can leave to private charities. They lack the scope. They lack the mandate. And for any of a number of reasons, these things need to remain municipal functions. And we would submit that not having a safe place to sleep at night is no less serious than any of the things that fire trucks, ambulances, police officers respond to. Well, then, what was the next step in the process? We saw the strategy. We thought it was a great strategy. We looked next at the gap analysis. What, according to the Anchorage Coalition in Homelessness, are we short on in executing on that strategy? Top line, shelter. Now, we recognize that there are a lot of other numbers on this, and we're short on other things, and we're going to address them. But we think that starting with health and safety is logical, and it's humane, and it's most appropriate, and it's a reasonable municipal responsibility. All of these other things, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, solutions, those are all longer lead time activities and arguably can be performed better by people in town who are already doing them. We've already seen excellent leadership from the Homeless Leadership Council and others to come up with these solutions. And that is certainly not to say that Mayor Bronson intends to partner with these folks and facilitate that process in a variety of ways. But we really wanted to focus on that humanitarian shelter gap. And then pulling some language from the Coalition in Homelessness gap analysis here in 2021, ensuring sufficient shelter capacity, especially during the winter, is critical for public health and safety. And we absolutely agree with that. Going a little farther down in the gap analysis, this is not ranked as high priority, it's ranked as moderately high priority, but it dovetails with what we think is important too, the capacity to outreach the entire Anchorage community. And we really embrace that. I think that we absolutely must set the bar at everyone. I don't know how we can set it anywhere else, to be honest. We're coming on towards the end of sort of an inadvertent experiment we conducted as a city. And global pandemic came, decision was made that we needed to provide congregate shelter to the homeless. We used the facility that was available to us there in the Sullivan Arena. And for the first time, Frank, I would submit, at large scale, or at least until Tony Mills partnered with Brother Francis in the mid-'80s, did the city really step into the shelter business. And it was largely funneling federal money, but still it demonstrated that the city can step into this space and do some good. And we heard from folks as diverse as the Parks Department that having folks in shelter ought to finally turn the corner and start getting ahead of the curve on camp abatement. And yes, there are pros and cons, and there are things that we did very well, and there are things that we could do better. But we've done the experiment. We've seen what happens when the municipality steps in and it can do it. And two of the big lessons that we learned from the Sullivan experience are one, we need to have the services for the homeless at all local shelters. Co-locate services with the people. It's a barrier for the people to get to the services. Okay? And that was certainly validated. That was actually the only thing that everyone I've talked to who is currently experiencing homelessness said. They had a variety of other comments, but every single one of them said, boy, I wish that service was here. It's a significant barrier for them to get where they need to go for a variety of reasons that are different for each individual. And the second big lesson is we need to be able to keep shelters open 24 hours a day. And that's for a lot of reasons, and not the least of which being is psychological. I have never had the experience of not knowing where I was going to sleep that night. These folks all do. And until you know that your bed is going to be there when you get back there at night, you don't have the safety and security, frankly, to start the process of working on all those other issues. And that, oh, by the way, is the foundation of the housing first, which we agree with. So, building on that, why a single campus? Well, first of all, math. When you set the goal as everyone, that becomes a relatively significant number. It's a shifting number. But it would require, if the shelters reach 50 to 100 people, somewhere between half a dozen or a dozen shelters spread throughout the community. Even if we had the money to do that, even if we had the political power to do that, I would submit that it would be well nigh impossible to acquire enough staff to do that. In my day job, I try to hire healthcare workers to come to Alaska. And it turns out we can pay a little bit better in the lower 48, but it also turns out it's not easy. Okay? And a lot of these folks that we need to staff this place are very similar professionals. They've got specialized training, they've got specialized skills, they've got the heart for it. It's hard to find these folks. And so when we can consolidate staff, not just money, we're more likely to succeed. There's also an argument that I've heard around that we should geographically disperse the shelters because that's where the homeless people are. And I would submit that the homeless people are in particular locations in town for structural reasons, perhaps historical reasons. But that convenience simply does not need to be a goal of a shelter. A shelter is there to be safe, it's there to be secure. It needs to be effective at navigating people because we're going to go to the next step. We're not really talking about shelter, we'll get to that, and we're talking about navigation centers. We want us to be effective at changing people's lives, to call it what it is. They need to have a little bit of privacy so that people can have dignity when they're in there and feel respected. They don't have to be convenient. And if you separate yourself from thinking that they need to be convenient, that lets you say, well, maybe we can put it in a place that is most likely to succeed, and that it has the infrastructure that we have learned is necessary for a navigation center or a shelter to be successful. All of that said, in talking to our partners, our friends here in town, the care providers, the people who are running shelters, they're adamant, and we agree, that a small shelter is better in many ways. It's better in engagement. It's better to be able to have that first step relationship between a staff member and a client that lets somebody change their life. Common sense, practically speaking, if you've got 200 people in a room in a bunch of open beds and one person's having a bad night, nobody's getting any sleep. So there are some practical reasons that small shelters are better in some ways. So but we've got this restriction. We don't think that we can succeed, and we haven't succeeded over several years of trying at multiple dispersed shelters. So how do we harness the advantages of the smaller shelters and the advantages of a single campus? I guess I'm going to get to that in a minute. Forgive me. Another question that folks have asked is, where has this worked? And I would submit that nowhere on the planet has anyone built a shelter and solved homelessness. We don't think it will. We don't promise that it will. We don't intend it to. However, we have also, and we've looked, and we're not perfect. There is probably some metropolis out there that we didn't look at. But none of them, not a single city in the United States at least, has successfully reached functional zero without shelter capacity. It would be like having a hospital without an emergency room. If you have an injury, you don't come from your car wreck straight to the operating room. You stop at a place where they decide what treatment you need. They take away your pain, they stabilize you, and they buy you that time to figure out what the solution is. And that's what a shelter really is when you do it right. When you do it wrong, it's a place with a bed and a roof. Or, not really wrong, but the way it was done in other places in the past, where now we've seen a little bit better ways where we can belt and suspenders and do two things at once. I'd like to talk about the Salt Lake City experience. They're a great benchmark. In around 2015, news articles reported that they reached functional zero. They were led by a statewide effort led by a fellow named Pendleton. He's an interesting person. He had no experience or qualifications that I can see working in social services or in taking care of the homeless. But he was a business person, and he was a convener. He was a person that could bring folks together and get them doing together the things that they were doing already on their own. They reached the functional zero. 3 years later, they decided to do an experiment. They decided to change. They stood down their large capacity shelters called the Road Home, I believe, or it's called Road Home. They're in Salt Lake City, and replaced it with multiple geographically dispersed smaller shelters that in some added up to less capacity than what they had before. And the news article started changing. Less than a year after that, they're trying to stand shelter capacity back up, dumping $19 million back in to rebuild what they shut down. Because each of the small shelters was over capacity, visible homelessness had returned to crisis levels, homelessness in general had surged. Is it cause and effect? I don't know, but it seems to me that this is a place that may have done the experiment both ways. Another city that is very frequently benchmarked currently is Houston. And I've never been to Houston. Actually, that's not true. I was in Houston many years ago. But I haven't had a chance, but I've read about them. I haven't had a chance to visit, but I've read about them. And people draw different conclusions from visiting with Houston. I would agree that Houston currently is best practice in the United States for addressing homelessness. They are very laser focused on housing first, rapidly finding appropriate housing for people with the support to make them successful in it. We agree with all that, but I want to point out two things. One, 2/3 of the people who are experiencing homelessness in Houston are in a shelter. They've got a lot of shelter capacity. That's a foundational step to their system. And the second thing that I would say is when a reporter with KXAN, I've got to do better with references on my slides, asked their version of the homeless coordinator, Mark Eichenbaum, what's the main thing? What's your success? He says, a carrot and stick approach is the best approach, where it's not just administration of services, but it's services with outreach. What does outreach mean? Saying, going out finding that person where they are, as opposed to where you might want them to be, and saying, hey, we got a better way. And if they say no, you go back and you ask them again. If they say no, you go back and you ask them again. And if they still say no, you say that's okay. But you can't stay here in our public spaces. You can't stay here on our streets. You can't impact negatively our other neighbors. Okay? And then in Houston, that stick is a camping ban, which would be gratuitous for us. We believe we've got plenty of municipal regulations already. So that's how we came to think about this. This is what we're thinking about doing. This is an artist rendition of what the structure may look like. This is geolocated on an old Google Earth picture. This is the old Anchorage Police Department's headquarters. This is an current impound lot. The building sits right on top of that. There's a missing road that goes to the impound lot, kind of runs roughly through there.
Dr. Morris, I need to know for the record, we were joined by Member Allard at 11:09, and just a slight time check, about a half hour, and then I'd like to turn to questions.
Feel free to interrupt me at any time.
Thank you.
Do you want me to finish it by noon or?
About 10 to
10
noon. If you can get through the slides, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay. getting the impression that my southern drawl has slowed us down. I'll do that. All right, so we believe the plan. Fundamentally, we believe that providing shelter to the unhoused is a necessary first step. It's the humane thing to do, it's the practical thing to do, and it's the legal thing to do. There aren't any reasons not to do it, frankly, that I can think of that outweigh any of those reasons. We examined existing available structures, and we haven't come to frankly all unsatisfactory. We'll get into that in a bit in terms of cost, function, and location. And so we propose instead to construct an intentionally designed, purpose-built, and strategically located navigation center. And frankly, this is really one of the few new things that we're bringing to the table. Everything else is in the plan already, the Anchorage home plan. What is new is that we would be building a purpose-built, intentionally designed, thoughtful approach to where we place a shelter, how we build that shelter, rather than using a building because it's available, someone has it, or any of those other unintentional reasons. So what is a navigation center? We've been talking about shelter a lot. Strictly speaking, we would not want to build a shelter. We want to build a navigation center. It's a term that came out of California. They invented it. A navigation center is a shelter plus, okay? So it's remarkably low barrier and high service. By low barrier, we mean that the only things that would keep you out of the building or deny you entry would be things where you're a threat to the health and safety of yourself or others, or you require immediate medical treatment. It doesn't mean it doesn't have rules, but persons who are intoxicated, for instance, can arrive here and find a way in. And this borrows from the Crisis Now model for mental health treatment, where there really isn't a wrong door. This is a place where people can go and be the lowest barrier of the several shelters we have in town. And I think this is a good point to highlight that we don't want at all to shut down any of the shelters that are in town. We think that keeping them and adding to them is what's necessary. And oh, by the way, when we stop and think about it, by doing so, we've got geographic dispersion of our shelters. And we also have some small shelters. And we'll have our campus that has small shelters within a big shelter. We'll get to that. But we get diversity of service, get diversity of thought, get diversity of providers. That's just an aside. Sorry, I'm trying to speed it back up. This will be open staff 24 hours a day. Currently, the Sullivan Arena. This isn't a criticism. It's a function of the reality of that they're trying to deal with. You come back too late, you don't get to come in. It does not matter if it's snowing. It doesn't matter if it's sunny. And there are several reasons for that. There are practical reasons, and there are safety reasons, and there are health reasons. But because we can design this building, we can engineer it so that doesn't have to be true anymore. And it also, you can enter the shelter and not be a disruption to others who are there sleeping. We can change the dynamic of when folks would have to line up in a neighborhood to get back in the shelter. They're going to know that there's a bed for them. They don't have to worry that, hey, despite our best efforts have allowed us to put 240 beds in our facility, but they look around and they say, there's 240 plus one of us out here. We need to get in line, and we're not going to get a bed. We can end that dynamic, and we can give that security to people. It can be, and when we talk about low barrier, we're talking very, very low barrier. People can have their significant others, their partners, their spouses, which are hard to navigate in many of the facilities we have here in town. People can have their pets as long as they're safe, and they can have their possessions. And we have talked to people who have successfully done all of these things, and they know how to build it. And we have partners in town who are adamant that they can staff it and fix it and do it. Okay, multiple, not to insinuate that we've signed a contract with anyone, but we've talked to people and we've assessed that the capacity to do everything that is on this screen exists in our town right now. And the biggest difference, I think, is conceptual. It's designed to help a person navigate to a solution to permanent housing. It is not simply a roof over your head and a bed and a meal. Okay, the philosophy on that is very different. I'm going to refuse to call it. I don't want to do any call-outs for any of the people that I've talked to, but someone I respect very much who works at a shelter here in town said that when you see somebody out on the street and they're not in the shelter, he says, what am I doing wrong with my shelter that they're not here? And oftentimes in shelters, when the person's still there in 60 days or 90 days, we ask that person, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you getting it done? Why aren't you getting out to being homed? With this type of center, if a person's still there in 30 days, we ask the question, what are we doing wrong that we haven't been able to find a solution for you yet? And we've created a place that would have privacy and dignity. And yes, there are a variety of people, but the building can have a variety of rooms that really reduce the ability or the reasonableness of saying no to entering this system. This is what a navigation center looks like. These pictures are all from San Francisco in some place called the Embarcadero. It's been many years since I've been to San Francisco, but I understand this is really expensive real estate. It's on the water. These are multi-million-dollar condominiums, and this is a homeless shelter / navigation center that they put up right in front of it. This is how they do the beds. We've shown this picture to service providers in town, and they've got some suggestions. This may or may not be what we would do, but this is what they're doing. This is not designed to help with CDC recommendations, but that's a much benefit. It's designed that when that person goes to sleep at night, they turn their head to the left, and they feel a sense of privacy. And they cut down on the noise, and they have a little bit more dignity. It's their space. This is a bunch of folks in suits at the opening, but this space is designed for homeless folks to have a place to spend the day when they're not on the inside working on stuff. And we just want to have 4 pictures because that'll be a symmetry. That's what the outside looks like. This is a tentative site plan for the facility. It sits on top of that parking lot I showed you earlier. I'd like to highlight this is not a road. This is a pre-existing, somebody cut a bunch of trees, and so it shows up on the topography that consultants have come up with to make this drawing. We, in the original or an earlier iteration of this, had a road coming in off Tudor Center Drive, which is a secondary road. That's been removed to stay out of the wetland area that's over here. And the engineers think that they can design it. This isn't final, of course, but this is where it was, and I thought it would be bad if I didn't show up on the diagram. The traffic flow would be coming in from off Elmore by the old APD headquarters. Come in, you can make a loop, and we can talk about some of the things that we might be able to set there. And then we can put fencing all around this so that it's less impactful to the trail system that goes around it, and much less, and it changes the entrance to being down here, farther away from the only neighborhood, which is up here. Okay. This is a concept drawing of what it is. They can actually put whatever you want. It doesn't have to be a big white building. In fact, they could put a forest inside the wall in one room and things like that. There's a faith-based provider doing just that over in Yakima, Washington. I don't have a picture because they haven't finished building it yet. But that provider's belief is that people like to be outside, and we can make them feel like they're inside, or feel like they're outside while they're inside, maybe they're more likely to stay. No reason to think that they're wrong, and they're putting a good bit of resources to making it happen. What I want to call attention to, though, is these boxes inside. And those are basically freestanding buildings. They share a roof like a townhouse. Each of those black lines is a soundproof exterior wall. So functionally and practically, we can divide this up into small shelters and try to gain those things that we know are advantages. If one person's having a bad night, somewhere between 30 and 50 people are going to lose sleep, not 200. We can, instead, normally in a shelter, you have a bunch of beds down here, you got a bunch of offices over here where folks do the navigation and the services. We're going to move a lot of those desks into each of these rooms so that people are with them all the time. There's a persistent presence for engagement to help build relationships. Modeled off of colleges. There's ample space for medical facilities, common areas. There's room even, one service provider offered to stand up medical alcohol detox at the facility. There's room for that here. That move on, I'm going to step back to PowerPoint one more time. That move alone is a game changer, I feel, for the community. Imagine instead, you're a person suffering from alcoholism, you're taken to the sleep-off center because you just had the worst night of your life. You wake up, you shower off, you're back on the street. Well, if we put the sleep-off center right over here, we've got medical detox right there, and we've got shelter right there. That person wakes up after that worst night in their life when they're thinking, if they're ever going to think about making a change, they want to make that change that day. And they're going to have to walk away from treatment or walk away from a safe bed if they want to do something different. And I think that alone is a game changer for a lot of our folks. How do we pick this site? We believe that healthcare resources need to be readily available, so we look for proximity to a healthcare facility. We learned that from our partners and friends who are providing services in town that we need a persistent law enforcement presence. In 2018, the municipality started dedicating an officer over to Brother Francis Shelter. Made a dramatic impact on the victimization of the people there. Made an impact on the neighborhood as well. That's difficult to do at arm's length. If you co-locate law enforcement with the shelter, that becomes just downright convenient. Okay? These are folks that are frequently victims and sometimes perpetrators. We wanted to obviously minimize the impact to neighboring residences and businesses. Believe me, this mayor has heard the people talking about cleaning up the town and not making the neighborhood worse. We wanted to be close to public transportation, or at least be able to arrange it at the location. We wanted to be able to secure enough space that there could be outdoor gatherings, people doing stuff outside, services, activities. We wanted it ideally to be municipally owned, so we don't have to buy anything, zoned appropriately already. And just getting into the weeds a little bit, we wanted to have a sewer pipe, a water line, and all that stuff to be there already. Turns out there's a location that checks every single box. It's, which we sort of hinted at it before, it's where the impound lot is. It's the old Anchorage Police Department headquarters. This is the Native Hospital campus. This is ball fields, woods, the nearest neighborhood. And I'd highlight that it would be very convenient to fence this perimeter off here and move and do the traffic flow from down here, where we're several city blocks, I would say, from the nearest neighborhood. It's called Site 27 because, well, frankly, we've been working as private citizens. We've got no office. We're using publicly available information. Site 27 is what was labeled on a site selection survey, I think, for a bus garage. So we stole the slides off that. I want to compare it quickly to another solution that's been tabled by the Alaska Club using that. I'm going to start at the top, talk about money. I don't have a definitive cost for you, and I wouldn't until we sign a contract. I know you've heard about how construction costs change daily. This one's a little bit immune to that because it's a prefabricated structure. If we go with this selection of type of structure, they fabricate it down in Salt Lake City. So that reduces that variability a little bit, but I would expect it's going to come in around $15 million. The price will go up the faster we have to build it. The sooner we start building it and the longer lead time, we can dramatically reduce that cost. The cost of the building itself is only about $5 million. The rest is constructing it, putting beds in it, that sort of thing. So there's been a lot of talk in the paper about this being a 1,000-bed facility. Well, the facility is going to have capacity for quite a lot of folks, depending on how it's configured. But it's not a reasonable expectation to think that we're going to have 1,000 people at this facility. More reasonable would be that we would have the Sullivan perhaps on a relatively bad day. And so I picked 400. Sometimes the Sullivan's over capacity at 450, 460. Sometimes at the beginning of the month, for instance, there's only a couple hundred people there. So let's say 400, divide 15 million by 400, that's 37,500 per person. It'll go down from there. By the Alaska Club for $5.5 million, it's got a max of 125 beds. Do that math, $43,000. And that admits the cost that I saw in a newspaper article saying that we got to put a new roof on it, plummet, foundation repairs. And I would submit also that there would be some significant quality differences in a purpose-built structure and a place that happened to be a gymnasium. Got a persistent adjacent police presence at the location we're suggesting. Police department is the University Police Department. I'm sure they're great too. 2.4 miles away. Major hospital distance, walking distance, there's a walking bridge over Tudor. Doesn't mean that we're going to be walking people to that hospital, but it's there. Okay. And it's also happens to be the busiest emergency room in the state. Alaska Club Hospital is 2.9 miles away. Both of them are on bus routes. However, only this one's zoned appropriately already. It's easy to fence it. It's around the woods. The other one's a corner lot. And it's away from residences and businesses. And the Alaska Club is surrounded by. Showing it to you on a map. Trees, entrance over here, nearest neighborhood, from there to there for Congress. Here's the Alaska Club in the center of the picture. These are all businesses. This is a neighborhood. You could throw a rock and hit somebody's house. Let's talk a little bit about the law. Figured prominently in the campaign. I have to confess, it figures remarkably less in our planning. People talk a lot about Martin versus Boise, where there was a lawsuit and it was determined that you can't abate camps, you can't get people off the street unless you've got adequate shelter for them. I'm going to be honest with you, it disgusts me that this is on the books. I can't believe that anybody ever tried to use police to punish poor people. Law enforcement is for removing predators from society, not removing victims. And the mayor doesn't think that the law enforcement is to be used for that either, despite what may have been perceived from the campaign. I'd like to talk more about one new and one old law. And they're not really laws, but I'm not a lawyer, but they're important. This judge here, guy in the tent shoes, walking through Skid Row, his name's David Carter. He filed an injunction, I think a month or two ago, against the city and county of Los Angeles, telling them that if they did not provide shelter, not definitive housing, not transitional housing, shelter, to every person on Skid Row by October 1st, and he had some earlier deadlines for special populations, but individual single men would be by October 1st, that's the last one, that until they did that, he was putting $1 billion of their budget in escrow, because their mayor said he was going to spend $1 billion on homelessness. And he was enjoining them from being able to buy or sell any real estate and assign a special master to make sure it all gets done. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I wrote the second fan letter of my entire life to this guy because he did that. Because I think that's the right way to go, and I wanted him to know that people relatively far away were paying attention. The city of Los Angeles is fighting setting up that shelter. I think they're on the wrong side of history, and I think they're on the wrong side of what's right. I'll try not to say any more political stuff. Leave that to my boss. There's another one. This one's much older. In 1981, something called a consent decree was what ended it. It was a case of Callahan versus Kerry. And this, frankly, is the reason why, and if you happen to be homeless in New York City, you and 94 of your fellow unhoused persons have a roof over your head on any given night. And if you live in California, only 1 in 3 of you do. They celebrate this as a holiday, and today it's probably a bit extraordinary. I don't think it's a parade or anything. But their version of the Anchorage Coalition in Homelessness celebrates it. And they consider it one of their greatest accomplishments. Now, if you look on their website now, they talk about permanent housing, making the shelters better, and it's been a long fight. But they know, and they appreciate that it is health and safety. It starts with health and safety. Shelters save lives. And I don't have the numbers for the decreases. This was posted in a legal journal, and they don't do it like they would in a medical journal. But I take them at their word that they save some lives by not making folks sleep in the cold. So how does this all apply to Anchorage? And I stole a newspaper article from here in town because I really feel that we're at a turning point in homelessness too. It's frankly why I explained to my wife, and she agreed that we were going to be working as much as we are because we think that frankly this is a unique opportunity for our city. We have we have so many things frankly teed up and ready to get definitive progress on this. And to be honest with you, I think the combination of this mayor and this assembly can actually be the right mix to get this done. We've got some federal money left. I see you frown at it, but I sincerely believe it. I think that on this issue, I really think that we can see we agree a lot more than folks might think. We've still got some federal money. We've just finished doing an experiment in the municipality working on shelter. And I think for all those reasons, now really is the right time. And Jasmine Boyle, who runs the Coalition on Homelessness, she's put in the paper, I'll use her name. We have to have government partners as part of the core team to addressing homelessness. We don't have control as homeless service nonprofits over the mechanisms required really to get to a solution. And we're absolutely engaged, soup to nuts with that. We're starting with the public health and safety because, well, Anchorage Homes assigned it to us. 2, we believe it's the humane thing to do. And all those other reasons, well, I'll try to speed it up, I'm not repeating. What are the next steps? And I want you to know that we're very serious about continuing engagement and partnership with folks. When they announced my new job for the transition team, they let me talk to the reporters for about 5 seconds. I managed to work in there that we believe in partnership, and partnership for us means that we consult with people who've been doing the work, ask them what we should do, listen, and act accordingly. I met with a stakeholder yesterday. He informed me that we're doing okay on that. We've developed a reputation for being good listeners in town. And I told him, that's great. I cannot wait to tell my wife there's a rumor going around. I'm a good listener. So the next steps, this is a rural cap-owned property off of Muldoon, low-income affordable housing. I can't say it enough. We don't believe the shelter is a solution. We think it's a necessary step. And it should be the first step for us as a municipality. These other pillars are important. Prevention is important. Funding for permanent housing is important. Navigation, coordinated entry, important, necessary. Table will fall without these pillars. I wanted to just shout out 3 things that I think are when I'm talking about how things are teed up for us as a community, not as an administration, as a community. Some successes that we've had together here in town that we'd like to build on and partner with. We think these are things to call out as successes. We think they're also things to build on and try to incentivize and increase. Nancy Burke, the previous homeless coordinator, working now with United Way and other partners, targeting high users of city resources, people that go to the emergency room often, interact with law enforcement often. Pilot project, they had, I believe, 19 people. Dramatic reductions in all of these measures. By any count, that's a reported great success. Coalition on Homelessness, one of the first municipalities in the country that has a quality by name list. That's a foundational step to being able to do true outreach. Current outreach in town, as described by a rural cap to me, is they go out, they meet somebody in the woods or on the street. That person that day, they're able to engage with them. They say, yeah, we want to come in. They say, great. And they ask you a whole bunch of questions. They ask them all the questions. They write them down. They go back to the office. They type them in the computer. Computer ranks them for priority versus all the housing that's available in town. And optimistically, 6 weeks later, they got a place to stay. If you ask the Coalition on Homelessness, they say it's more like a year. A lot can happen in 6 weeks when you're living in the trees. None of it's good. And oh, by the way, you got to go find that person again. But imagine what it would be like if we lived in a place where we had an emergency room, we had a navigation center. When you go out and you talk to somebody and they say yes that day, you say, come on, get in the car with me. And you go there right then. And you can spend that 6 weeks someplace safe while we work on getting those other solutions. Okay? One thing I really want to call attention to, because I really love it, I think Crisis Now is a great model. It's a separate but very conjoined effort to help with mental health treatment and support here in town. It's got a lot of partners. One thing that we really love, and we applaud, rather, because my speech and tone makes it hard to pronounce Ellis, that they simply funded these mobile crisis teams. We like to leverage that. We think that there's a lot of overlap between mental health problems and homelessness. And we don't think it's too much of a stretch to tell these teams, hey, go out and engage with folks that are having some mental health trouble, but start with the ones that don't have a roof over their head and see how that works out. And this is a place where we're in agreement. And there are other follow-on steps. Both Providence and Native Hospital are standing up the next levels of this crisis now system, the equivalent of the mental health emergency rooms. And there are lots of ways that we can work together as a municipality with those private leaders, they are leaders, to get change going in those areas. This is a slide just to let you know that we are not just focused on homelessness and housing. We think affordable housing is something we are desperately short on here in this town. We're aware that the vacancy statistics are incredibly low. And just to, and I'll end with that. I think we're at time. That's all. I think I'm okay. Take questions now.
Great, thank you, Dr. Marks. So I'm going to get you either by text or just a wave of the hand. I'll do my best to track both. And we have Mr. Constant in the queue to start.
Hey, sir, I have, I think, more questions. I don't know how many other folks have questions, so we don't have to answer all the ones that I present. Firstly, you spoke that convenience is the goal. And the converse of that point is people have to choose to use the service. So what's the method for motivating people to use the service if it's not convenient? Second, the Embarcadero example that you used with the $1 million condos.
Is there any possibility we could do the questions one at a time?
Sure.
That's fine. Yeah, if you want to do, we'll try to do 2 or 3 questions a number. Emily can just roll back through.
Okay. Thanks. It doesn't need to be convenient. People have to choose to go there. How do you deal with that? Well, we draw on the experience of other places who have done it. The Embarcadero, for instance. That's the second or third navigation center that they've built. That navigation center is actually more restricted in entry. We steal a phrase, we believe in no wrong door. So if somebody knocks on the door of the shelter, they're going to come in. At the shelter at the navigation center that's successful in San Francisco, and I'll tell you why I think it's successful in a second, they are refused entry if they knock on the door, if they happen to live there. They have to be brought there via any of the varieties of outreach that are going on in the city. And they're finding it successful. The reason I say it's successful is because they looked at it and they said, let's build 4 more. And coincidentally, each of them that they are building is going to be of larger capacity. It's going to be 200-person buildings at a pop. I'm sorry, there was the next one's about something about the Embarcadero.
Yeah, thank you. And that's absolutely enlightening to think that they have now 3 or 4 new locations that they're coming up with for their services. So the Embarcadero example, that is in a pretty dense residential and commercial district, is it not?
That's my understanding.
Right. Okay, that's good. And then I would just say as a statement that it is a very sharp double-edged sword to think of utilizing police as a permanent presence in a private operation. And so we have to really carefully think through the ramifications of what that means. Insofar as this would be the first example I could think of where we would be appointing publicly sworn officers to serve private interests. So it's an area of investigation we really have to put some thought in policy. The final question is kind of twofold. You have a property that is located on some pretty intense wetlands. And so the first question is, have we thought about what that's going to take to move through the process to get an approval? Because I understand that those lands are developable, but very complex. Then the second part of that question is that while it may seem ideal that this location isn't surrounded by dense residential or commercial interests, 2 summers ago we had a massive fire right there just across the road. And that fire was in a very dry area, and it was, I believe, in the end, the finding was that it was started by people burning wire to turn into cash for their homeless living. And so that area is surrounded on all sides by wildlands that lead to woods-bound neighborhoods, Hillside, Elmore, south towards Abbott Loop, and then Stuckerton Heights. Have you been in discussion with the proper folks who would understand fire mitigation, and has that been incorporated in the plan? If so, how?
I heard that there is with fire mitigation, but I think there are a few things in there. As far as the wetlands go, this was considered a top 2 choice site for the bus barn or something, whatever it was. And so the mitigation was viewed as, for wetlands, was viewed as a reasonable and not overcomable obstacle. I'm certainly not an expert on that, and I won't pretend to be. I do know that the engineers that have been consulting on this, and by the way, just to talk about the support that this idea has in the community. I don't know, I'm new to politics, so it's unusual for me to get phone calls from people I don't know and emails from people I don't know. We get unsolicited emails from people offering to help. And one of them, don't want to say who, because I'm about to say I think he's the best engineer in the state, said, hey, we'll take care of your engineering for free, or to be honest, he did say sharply reduced for free. So tossing that out there. So the engineers think that the wetlands issue is not a big deal. They've done a number of projects with the Corps of Engineers. They have good working relationships. A contractor in town, similar assessment, they made a change on an entry to try to mitigate that further. As far as the fire goes, I don't really think that this building's by itself a fire hazard. Coincidentally, it'll be sprinklered. That's included in the budget price. I think that more germane to what you're asking about, though, is are we going to tolerate folks camping in the woods around this shelter? And the answer is absolutely not. That's part of that stick thing, where folks are going to be offered, do you want to come in? Do you want to come in? Do you want to try some help? No, that's okay, but you can't stay here. And one of those places is absolutely going to be the woods around the place. And there are already folks camping there. And they were blamed for the fire a while back that you alluded to. And they're also a persistent problem for the police department. They're vandalizing the heck out of the impounded cars and creating some trouble for them. So we need to intervene in this area. And I think that having a persistent presence there, frankly, would frankly do it better. It comes down to how you do it, and we intend to do this well. We're doing a belt and suspenders approach here, where it's not just a shelter, it's a navigation center. We're trying to make it that much more appealing to people, that much more effective for people, and in that way, in my day job, we like to have redundant systems for things that are important. We really have redundant systems for everything that's important here.
So I just had a last note on the question, of course, but the optimism of the permitting of that site, the project with the bus barn there has been in the process for years, but for the lack of, not for the lack of trying, but for the lack of the ability to get the permits, it has been bogged down for 18 months, literally bogged.
Okay, we're going to move through the queue here. We've got a pretty good one. Ms. Allard.
Thank you for the presentation. Appreciate it. So my question is a simple, basic question, but throughout your entire presentation, you kept referencing we. So when talking about we are deciding this or we, who are you actually saying is the we?
Well, I think we as the city of Anchorage, the reason that we're here 2 weeks before we even enter office and against political advice is because we want to do this together. To do this right, we have to do this together. And I don't know if that's our definitive policy statement, but that's my belief. And more than that, I think that the Assembly and the mayor-elect are going to have plenty of things they can disagree on over the next couple of years. This is an issue that I think you might discover that we can agree on. And if we do, and we succeed at it, we'll be able to point back and say, hey, we agreed on that, we got something done, and we did something good for everybody. And I think that really makes this effort worth it. In addition to the humanitarian issue, the opportunity to be able to send that message to a city and not to sound too, pie in the sky, but the country seems kind of divided right now. And I think this is an issue that's just right and wrong, not political.
Thank you. So I put myself in the queue, and these questions are actually ones you may want to take back and get back with us on. But one is from, a go, if you were to get a go to do this, a timeline in each phase of the project through the timeline, all permits, the construction, all the way through, and how that fits within both our procurement or contracting Title VII processes. And when I say go all the way through, that includes operators. So that would just be a follow-up for later. And the second is the capacity, has it been modeled and in light of what the current CDC guidance is on 6 feet of spacing? And if we could learn a little bit more about that. But both of those could be taken offline, and maybe you can get back to us, because we do have quite a few in the queue.
Oh, okay. I can answer them as you prefer.
So next, we have Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We received a very long list of questions from a number of different community stakeholders, which I know have been shared with the administration, so this is going to be an ongoing process. I won't repeat any of those, but there were a lot of really specific questions that I know you received. So some of the bigger picture ones. First, I represent some of the neighborhoods that are near here, as does Mr. Rivera, Mr. Peterson, and Ms. Zolotel. And I can't speak for them, but I can say for myself, I've been contacted already by a number of people in those districts, a number of those community councils. Who should they speak with? If they want to speak directly with your incoming administration, what email address should I give them?
What email address? I'm going to get back to you on that one. That one, I can answer all your questions now, but that was.
If you have somebody who wants to help.
So if you have any questions, you can email us at info@bronsontransition.com.
And I will say, on Thursday, there's a community meeting that we're going to have to talk about this. It's open to everyone. Okay, open to everyone.
I'm sorry, when and where is the community meeting?
I have that information. I was going to announce at the end of the meeting. So it's on the 17th at the Willamar Theater, just across the hall from 5 to 7 p.m. And it will be a community dialogue.
Great. Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful. So you mentioned a $15 million price tag, or you don't think it'll get that high. But what is the pool of money?
Well, I'm hoping on July 1, we'll find that there's some money left and we'll find something to do with it. I honestly don't know. I'm a private citizen, I only know where money is based on Google and the news. But I have high hopes.
I'd like a little more specificity than that. So it's $15 million. Presumably it could come from the former CARES Act money, which was set aside for some of the other projects. But it was the position of your boss and his supporters during the campaign that was illegally used for homelessness, could not be used for homelessness, and that these funds had to be audited, that kind of thing. Is that no longer your position? Now that money can be used for homelessness?
I'm not in a position to speak for my boss. But I can say that there are a number of funding sources that are mostly federal in nature that are absolutely indicated for this type of effort, and there may be others. I would also say that if you look at a budget of, say, $15 million, or say $20 million, and an operating cost would be on the order, we don't know that either, in case that's a follow-up question, because, again, we don't have any signed contracts with anyone. We're private citizens, and frankly, we won't know until we do. But anticipated being on the order of the soul, maybe 12 million. That adds up to $30 million, something like that. That's 2 to 3% of the municipal budget. Not saying that's where we need to fund it from, but I think that's an important point of reference for scale of problem, scale of investment. In our city up until now used to be the municipality, go ahead and put money in this problem at all. And you guys have shown what happens, and a lot of it's good when you do. And it's nice when that money comes from someplace else, and I think that we can get that money from someplace else this time too. But I also don't think it's bad for us to use our money for it, because I don't know if anybody actually read it, but I wrote a letter to the paper, and I think that if government isn't taking care of the weak, then we're not going to be doing much. And so I can't think of too many better things to spend the money on.
I know Mr. Dunbar has a follow-up, and then we're going to, 4 more individuals in the queue, so we're going to go a little bit more rapid fire.
I'll do my best.
Well, I did want to ask about that operating cost. That's really interesting to me too. Are you proposing in the short term that we use FEMA money, and in the long term we use alcohol tax money? What are the specific funding sources for the operating costs?
My answer doesn't change from previously. I believe there are a number of federal pots of money. FEMA may be one of them. I don't know. There are others that have been unaware of. And I think that we'll be able to give you more specific answers on that when we're actually in office.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Perez-Rudia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hi. Thanks for the great presentation. I'll try to keep my questions sort of at a high level because I know there's a lot of specifics that we need to work out as it moves forward. One of the things you referenced throughout your presentation is the importance of outreach. And I guess I'm curious about, it seems central to your plan in order to actually get people there and to make this work. Do you have thoughts about what the outreach plan is? Who will do it? Sort of how will that work surrounding this as it relates to your plan? I didn't see a slide on that. So.
Thank you for asking. I really like talking about outreach. It is a key component because I think it's where it all starts, is with this relationship. And what we've seen in talking to all those folks in that first slide, all those different logos, groups as diverse as the Parks Department, where folks who are going out there handing socks to homeless people and engaging them and building a relationship, and perhaps more solution-oriented, the Anchorage Fire Department, standing up a de novo outreach effort that targeted high utilizers with tremendous success. That's outreach. The Safety Patrol picks up an intoxicated person, that's outreach. When Rural Cat goes out in the woods, that's outreach. The mobile crisis teams, they could go out in the woods, that could be outreach. The Anchorage Fire Department is, to answer your question, I think we would lean heavily towards augmenting existing civilian charities like Rural Cap, Choices, who I haven't had a chance to talk to, but we're going to lean on the fire department. I think that's the right uniform to wear when you're entering that kind of area. Those folks have a cultural, institutional knowledge of what's safe. They have the ability to deal with dangerous situations. And they're a trusted provider. People, it's a different uniform than a badge and a gun. Not to say that people should trust law enforcement, but I think they're the natural partner for that. And they're already doing it.
And you referenced the Houston model and the power of their outreach. I had a chance to go there to meet with them, and just would say that the coordination of all those agencies, and so that they're all using a similar platform and policies and processes, and making that a wall of work is certainly one of the challenges in front of you if you want to try to do that.
Yes, sir. It really is, and it's a tough one for me because it involves computers, which I consider magic boxes. But we've had a lot of conversations with Jasmine Boyle and several others, and just to avoid the name dropping, where there's a lot of room for improvement in HMIS, which is the computer system that lets you do all this stuff. And different types of platforms that will be actually easy for providers to use, they can take with them on the streets and do true coordinated entry, where when you have a place, when you have a person, you've got a destination for them.
Yeah. And I'll just wrap it through. I mean, I think these are the questions that most people are looking at. That transportation, funding, who actually does the work?
I'm sorry, can you grab a different mic? You're all garbled. I apologize.
Is that better?
Yes.
Maybe?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just, transportation, funding, who does what? I think a big piece of it for me is that there's always this conversation of what role does the municipality play and what role do service providers play. And so that mix is something I'm interested in hearing as we go down the road. And just the last piece that I would say is that the effort to actually get people there. I think that's that effective piece that you heard earlier of if you build it, we hope they come, right? But all that infrastructure around it are pieces that we've been working on for years, and I think in order for this piece, for your idea to be successful, all of those other pieces have to be in place, and I'm not sure they're in place yet. So just any reaction to that, and then I'll let the next person speak. Thank you.
I'll be very brief, and I'll table and get back to you on the strategy for service or provision. But I would highlight that all those other things that we're working on that are the solutions that you talked to about are long lead time. It's going to take us a while to get them. And in the meantime, we can either choose to say, well, it'd be nice if we had these great solutions. Until then, we're just going to maintain the status quo. Or we can choose to act now and bring people in from the cold, have a shelter, while we keep working on doing these things that you're doing well. And we're not slowing down. We're going to speed up. We're a highly motivated crew on this.
Thank you. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Most of my questions have already been addressed, but I just want to thank you for the presentation, and then really want to reinforce what Mr. Dunbar had stated around the costs, both where we're going to get the funds and then what the funds are going to go to, and having a real detailed breakdown of those. I understand that you don't have those at the moment, but having that when you're in office, I think would be very helpful for the Assembly and the community to get a better understanding of where these monies are coming from, where they're going to go to, and then, as we have sometimes seen with some other projects, sometimes they might be more expensive than we initially think. So having those types of contingencies in place would be helpful to understand. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Morris, for the presentation. I very much appreciate this opportunity to discuss the plan. And some of my questions, like others, have been asked before, and I look forward to those responses. Ms. Chair Zolotel brought up the issue of time frame and public process, and that's one of particular importance to me, and particularly I heard in the presentation that some contract discussions are underway, and besides the fiduciary responsibility, that clearly is of great importance to folks in the body. There's also the issue of not being sued and litigation, and definitely no one should enter into contracts without any appropriation of funds is one aspect. But I would like to hear about the legal analyses of the project, and understand we're almost out of time. That's something that definitely can be added to the list of follow-up items. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I feel compelled to say that if I said that some contract had been signed, I misspoke. I don't recall saying it, but I'm sorry if anyone heard that. We haven't signed any contracts. We specifically are waiting to even offer such things till we have an opportunity to, let me go back to the reason that we're here 2 weeks before we take office. We're here because we want to work with you to do this. We do not intend to do it alone. We would strongly prefer to do it with you. There hasn't been any signing or anything of any measure.
Thank you. Mr. Littleton.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate your presentation, and particularly, when people think about homelessness, they think about shelters, and if you show them that is just a little piece. You don't have to dig too deep to realize that's a little part of the whole process of this issue. So I appreciate your framing it that way. And much of what you've seen, you present here, I've seen. I visited Trader House in Hollywood, which does the strong building and the services right there. So we've seen it. I visited Pine Street Inn. It's been there for many, many years, and they're building it after it being they're not putting a shelter next to them. High-end condos. This is a gentrified area, and shelters don't have to be a disaster for the neighborhood or the area around it. And we see that here in town. Well-run shelters that aren't. So and that's important. And then the notion that no tolerance for camping around this location. Trader House does that. This was one of their agreements with the neighbors. So it's something that can be done. And I think the size was an issue of 1,000 seems we're not ready to manage that. I don't think maybe 400 we've done some, but even that is quite large and will be a challenge. And your costs, I mean, obviously we need to see that fleshed out, but I saw there for the Elastic Club, you get an update on that, because one, their capacity, we've been thinking 125, but they could, if they don't do the CDC separation and different configurations, get up double that fairly easily. Also the roof they took care of, there's a number, I think the issues you put there is the agreement we made, they fixed that, so that's what substantially cut the cost. So it's a much cheaper facility than I think you may be looking at. So check with the Elastic Club folks, and I think the administration probably has updates on that too. One of the things that, having the city run a shelter is a profound change. I mean, maybe it's what's needed, but if there's ever a constant theme in emails I get is the city shouldn't be in the shelter business, other people do it better, government's not the solution to running these. And that's a big philosophical issue, but be ready for that. Maybe that's what we have to do. We've clearly been putting more cash into it in the last couple of years than in decades, but we get beat up for spending millions on homeless when people don't realize we spend very little on it. It's city money, city tax money. So that's going to be a burden for you. But anyway, and I know we have a long list of questions that you were sent, and that covers it.
It's come to my attention that I may have miscommunicated about something else. There's a difference between the city building it and the city running it. The city doesn't really have the expertise to run that shelter. The city knows, or we know, many people in this town who do. So I kind of, perhaps it comes back to definitions. The city runs the Sullivan Arena. I don't think they do. I think private agencies in town do. That would be a very similar model to what we would do. I think it would be, we would suggest as a model, the city own the building so that we can hold accountable to outcomes, the service providers inside of it, but not do the direct provision of services. And that would also allow us to keep our promise that we've been making as I've been talking to these service providers in town, that we don't really want private charity funding for this. But the private charity funding could go directly to them while they provide those services at the center.
Great, thank you. So I know I had a few members who already asked questions in the queue. I'm actually going to make sure every member gets a chance. So Ms. Kennedy, then Mr. Peterson, and if we have time, we'll roll back through the other members.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Morris, for the presentation. I really appreciate the attitude to just listening to you talk about this vision that you know so many in the community really want to get behind. So my question, and you may have touched on this a little bit, you were referring to the fact that you would be relying pretty heavily on the fire department to provide a lot of this emergency response that involves outreach. And I was wondering if you've also played with any numbers in terms of other departments within the municipality that would need to beef up their staffing, and if you had a sense of how many more people do we need in Parks and Rec? Or do we have to put some more people in the health department or even with the police department? So have you had a chance to think about how this might impact just the municipal employee numbers?
That's a great question. As far as Parks and Recreation goes, we would think, if anything, if we're successful, it would reduce the demands on them for cleaning up camps and so forth in the long term, at least. And that was, I believe that was the message I got from meeting with them, what they've seen with Sullivan. They've really turned the corner on camp abatements and started making some forward progress with shelter capacity. The health department, I think that they absolutely have a part to play here in town. I think that the health department is sort of and I'm trying to step far afield from where I'm not an expert, but so please grant me some grace for that. They seem to have two arms, one's policy and one's provision of services. And I don't know where provision of services arm would extend to this shelter. I think that all of the services that I can imagine at the navigation center would be best performed by private partners, South Central Foundation, others who are currently at the Sullivan. And I'm not aware of the health department providing services at the Sullivan currently. And the police, I'm going to leave that to other agenda items.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for the presentation. When I initially spoke with the transition team about this, they mentioned that they weren't going to do food service on site. we're planning to bring it in. And when you started your presentation, you mentioned the cafeteria. And so it is a significant distance to the nearest grocery store. So it makes sense that there has to be some sort of food on site. So are you planning to prep it on site or just serve it on site? Thank you.
Well, sir, well, I think you might be the last assembly member, I hope I didn't interrupt this way. I just wanted to say, take a minute and say thank you for being not quickly mean to me. Never been difficult. The model that we've seen service providers using in town is prepare the food at one location, put it in a vehicle, take it to the other location. That's a model that we're considering for this to the degree that there's going to be a vehicle-sized door by the food preparation and distribution area. And then that lets you move all that infrastructure, which is pretty expensive, to someplace that already exists in town. The experts they exploded and say, yeah, just stick with that. You've got good people in town that are good at making food. Stick with it.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. So we can do, I have two additional members who've already asked questions in the queue. We can do those briefly, and then I want to turn to audience participation. Ms. Allard, no? Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thank you. It might be a question for the mayor-elect, and it might be that it's not a question that's proper for answering on the spot. But it could be. There's a couple parts to it. Part of it is just general. The Nevada Cares Campus, as previously stated, or was generally put out there, that this was based on the Reno model. And then the argument came, well, it's not really anymore because there's so much more to consider. But at its basis, the Reno model, like the San Antonio model that we discussed, they in the end have an $86 million, nearly $100 million cost for implementing the campus. They use CARES Act funding. And an operational cost in Reno for their plan of $8 million. I have never been shy to say what we have to do to respond is provide a very resource-rich environment until such time as we have a system that works. This is going to bring me to my question. Mayor Bronson, during the campaign, a number of people who I would characterize as your supporters said a lot of pretty incredible things. And I've been hearing this even before you were engaged in a race for mayor, things that set homeless people up as being an other or in some way a demeaned population within our community, that we have to do things to them because of our own peace and safety. In particular, someone at the last meeting made a pointed statement that you support homeless people but not us. And all that leads to what I find is a dehumanization of these individuals in our streets. And I'm hoping that we can hear from you, and really to your supporters, a message that says we have a duty to deal with the humanity of these individuals and maintain that in all of our responses so that we can maintain our own humanity in moving forward with whatever projects have to come. I would hope that you can bring a message forward to those folks so that people can hear that it's a unified message.
As to the extreme comments, I've never said that in our multiple conversations, obviously. I've never said that.
I certainly wasn't going to leave you.
We've got extremes on both sides. We've spoken to those on the left who are elected politicians from this area, and they said some pretty extreme things too. I wouldn't judge you by that, of course. Because in our conversations, I think you and I we understand where point A is, which is now, where point B is, and it's only the path in between that we differ on. You and I are pretty much in the same premise on where to get to. So, I've never said any, I've said continuously all throughout this process for the last 10 months, about 9 months ago when I met Dr. Morrison, and I read his preliminary plan, is that's the way, this is a compassion-based approach to me, because a compassionate approach solves the problems in the long term, which cuts down costs, and because I'm a fiscal conservative, this has to pencil, it always does, and Mr. Weddleton mentioned, we've never really paid for dealing with homelessness. counted on the P3s to help us out. We counted on grants to help us out. And I hate to say it, at some point, the taxpayer is also going to have to pay through this. And Mr. Dunbar mentioned it's quite probably some of the revenue that we get from the alcohol tax. So yeah, we've got to move forward. My biggest fear, and I'll just here to tell you this, is that if we're successful in this initial phase, and we start reducing the impact on the street from the visible homeless, we go back to apathy. Okay, and they think too many people will think this problem is solved. On the left and on the right, they say, well, there's people aren't living on our street corners anymore. Well, we still have a huge problem left that we're all, all of us are left to deal with going forward. And so it's a communication problem, it's an education problem of the public at large. Sometimes you just need a new set of eyes on it, and that might be me, it might be Dr. Morris, but we've got to come to a final solution on moving forward. We've got to see the end game and understand this. It's always been a compassionate approach that I've always taken because, and I've said it time and again on the campaign trail, I've said these are our brothers, our sisters, our families, and we can't leave them to freeze to death on the streets. Civilized societies don't allow this to happen. So I hope that answers it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Morris, for being with us today and for the presentation. For those of you who joined on Facebook or you want to take another look at this presentation, it is on the committee's website. I'm sure there will be continued dialogue as we have heard. The transition team will be holding their community dialogue from 5 to 7 on the 17th in the Willow Marston Theater. And we will look forward to continued answers to the questions that members have presented offline. With that audience participation, Mr. Oliva had made a request to go first today, and we'll extend for 5 minutes if there's no objection. Okay, Mr. Oliva, and we'll have a room for about 2 to 3 more individuals. You have 3 minutes. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful presentation. I couldn't have did better myself if I was the homeless coordinator. But that's where it gets into what's missing in the first picture, is you have partners and you deal with these partners, but you don't have a member of the public who's been negatively affected. Compassion, dignity, care. You lost health, safety, economic interference, and hey, it hurt. Today is tax day. I got shorted on the purchase of my property. Mr. Constant confirmed it, $200,000. I'm in foreclosure, tax foreclosure. I begged you, because I was late with the tax payment, I paid it in full to forgive the penalty and the interest. Now I'm stuck with $9,700 more, and it's a tough goal after the pandemic. But the economic interference by the homeless shelter and being adjacent to it, whether I sued them and got $30,000 and came to this assembly and offered it back for garbage pickup, a medic, and security, you didn't take it. At 800 calls. When it went to 10,000 police calls next door to me, I sued you again to get your attention, but because of the legal technicality signing the release, it couldn't go to the Superior Court. No, my deal has fell through because I ran out of money to move and a location to move to. You tied my hands, and the slowness of the government money coming down, I'm stuck. And to tell you, this is similar to the Love Canal, my property. They came in, they polluted, they left, and they left the pollution. Because I could go down on my lot today and pick up a ton of garbage by Brother Francis Shelter and Bean's clients. And hey, I'd like to dump it over there at the Archbishop's place. as a message, not as an act of civil disobedience. So, this is a sad state of affairs, but you haven't listened to the public. You listen to providers without any accountability or transparency what they did with the money. And why would you buy Beans Cafe? They made an investment downtown. Why can't I do that in the private sector? Why couldn't my investment make a rate of return for all the employees that I have, including the homeless? It's just real voodoo economics, if
Thank you,
anything.
Mr. Oliva. That was your time.
I didn't see the clock.
I don't have control over this. I have this one. So it was.
Well, you gotta give me a warning.
Sorry, I'll waive it
Give me
next
an
time.
extension.
So, no, not today. Sorry.
As
We
a
have-
professional,
We have
an
three
expert.
additional people behind you that
Extend
would
the
like to
meeting
provide.
10 minutes.
We have, so thank you, Mr. Oliva.
I tried.
Mr. Haberman. And just so we're clear, we'll go through, Mr. Couples, do you intend to speak? Okay, that will be our last speaker, and we'll have to conclude the meeting. Please go ahead, Mr. Haberman.
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman, last resident for 43 years, 20 of those years, Anchorage resident, and currently a Memphis Valley resident. I follow the public process. When the public process is done appropriately, decision made by the governing body is more likely in the public interest. First, I would like to thank the transition team for the future administration of the city, which starts only a few weeks from now. And I would like to say this. You had hearings on dealing with the homeless recently and shelters, and you have plans that have been discussed, and yes. But I would say at this point in time, it's very important this time that you delay the decisions, because you just heard a presentation from the new administration, and the public needs to digest that. And you need to digest that, and you need to bring back the public in this room, these assembly chambers, and have that discussion and have a new public hearing with respect. And you can't do a rush for judgment here. You need to hear from the people with all due respect. Second is this. This is the assembly chambers. This is where you make decisions. But you seem to have a plan to do it elsewhere. Today, the administration, future administration of the city, did a very important statement presentation dealing with homeless. But how could the public hear it? If you listen to Facebook, it was garbled. Having a situation of changing the technology where you already have a valuable tool economically in the back of the corner for that media for reaching out, this is no time to change the plans. You need to use those resources that you have and not do patchwork and use other resources, because look what's happened. We have a new administration coming in. They need to be heard. The people need to hear this. With all due respect, the technology used for this room created a distance so the people in this room were able to hear, but the people outside this room could not hear, with all due respect. And yes, you could say Facebook, but that's not the right tool, and people are trying to hear and they could not hear. Second is this. The issue of homeless, I especially thank you very much for addressing it and being involved. In the Valley, I yet recall a single time that the homeless were reviewed in Maxborough with over 100,000 people. And I thank all of your effort. I thank the people in this room. But there's one voice that's not in this room, that continues to not be. You're not hearing. It's the homeless. You're making decisions of people who are not in this room, and that is absolutely wrong. We need to be all part of the conversation. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Haberman. Hi, please go ahead.
For the record, my name is James Wojciechowski. I've been coming to these assembly meetings now for, I think, 6-7 months. It was very refreshing to watch this presentation. Thank you, Dr. Morris. Well done. But what was most refreshing for me as a member of the public was to look at the body language of those of you sitting up on the dais. It seemed to be very receptive. Mayor Bronson ran on a platform of a new direction. And I personally, I think, am now optimistic that maybe that new direction can be something that we all can move towards together. This assembly and the new mayor. I would also like to echo, my phone kind of blew up with texts during this from friends who work for a living, couldn't be here, and couldn't understand a word on the Facebook live feed or the YouTube live feed. So I'm not sure what the deal was with that, because all the assembly meetings generally are pretty clear and you can follow them. I hope there's some way that can be cleaned up retroactively, probably not. But anyway, I just wanted to say, again, thank you, Dr. Morris, and I really hope that we all can work together on this. Thank you.
Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Manager. Yeah, I just wanted to address that. So we will also have, the clerk's office will eventually put up a recording that should be very crisp and clean for everyone to hear. We have a recorder here in the front that is really good at catching everyone's audio. So I understand that the Facebook Live may not have been great for audio, but we will have a recording that everyone will be able to hear soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. And this would typically be where we would hold a committee meeting. We would typically be at City Hall, either in the Assembly Conference Room or the Mayor's Conference Room, and we did choose this venue due to the size of the crowd we were expecting, and because the Mayor's Conference Room has had audio issues, even for those in the room. So we're doing our best with the options available, but I do encourage the public to look for that recording. Mr. Coppels, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. For everyone in the room, my name is Rob Couples, and I am the grandson of Avis and Archie Couples, who in 1950 bought property and built their lives at the corner of 3rd and Hyder. That was 70 years ago, and I am now the owner and caretaker of that family property. I tell you this because Mr. Oliva, when he first spoke, mentioned about individuals who have personally experienced the property impact, economic impact, the issues that our neighborhood has experienced for 30 years as a result of operations of the shelter in our neighborhood. And in addition to being a longstanding member of this particular troubled community, I'm also a member of the 3rd Avenue Radicals, and I was also the author of a letter and opinion piece in November of 2017, which identified the exact parcel of land that's been highlighted in this particular presentation for all of the exact same reasons that were highlighted in this presentation. At the time, almost 4 years ago, when I identified this parcel and wrote this opinion piece, I never expected it to become a shelter or to really be seriously considered or adopted. It was more a tool to expand the conversation and broaden people's way of thinking about how and where we shelter people and what makes sense. So to see 4 years later, this future administration come along, pick up my vision from 4 years ago, brush the dust off of it, and recognize its value is wonderful to see. So I want to thank you for that. I also wanted to, this is not an easy proposal to put forth in front of the city, and I want to commend not only Dr. Morris, but of course Mayor Bronson for their vision and their courage to even put forth such a plan that pushes the boundary and forces this city to think outside of a 30-year failed box. So for that, thank you, and I hope as you move forward, as Mr. Oliva indicated, you will reach out to members such as myself, other members of the 3rd Avenue Radicals who have direct experience with community impact. Because I think that we have incredibly valuable knowledge for you. So I hope moving forward, you'll lean on us as a resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Couples. 1 second, please. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. So you just ended on the note that I wanted to ask you a question about, which was what advice would you have for these two publicly, that would be the mayor-elect and his homeless coordinator for the transition, on providing some comfort to the people who are nearby the location proposed, that they aren't, or we as a city aren't going to recreate the problems that were levied on your family and everyone in that area? Because that's my biggest fear, is that we recreate a monster that we just figured out a way to undo.
So there needs to be a system of accountability to the people of those communities. Not only accountability from the service providers and the individuals who operate these facilities, but a system of accountability from the municipality itself to the community. And there's aspects of the shelter licensing proposal that I agree with. There's aspects that I disagree with. But I think there's components in there that I think that document opens the door to acknowledging that there needs to be a system of accountability. And that's a component of that document that I adamantly support. That they're obviously, shelter operators, their ability or their jurisdiction ends at their property line. However, how they operate their facility, those impacts go far greater than their property line. And East 3rd Avenue is a prime example of a failure to protect a neighborhood and to provide accountability for the providers. But on the flip side, for many years, our city, our government, our police department has turned a blind eye to the problems that happen there. And that's not on the providers. That's on us. That's on our police department. That's on our mayors. It's on our assembly. It's on everyone. And so it's important to provide accountability to those people and have some mechanism of enforcement of that accountability to provide them the assurance that what we've done on East 3rd Avenue, that'll never happen again.
Thank you. That is my mantra.
So we are already over time. Ms. Allard has a question, and we have one more individual. Is there any objection to just finishing those things up from the members? Okay, Ms. Allard, please go ahead, and then we'll hear from Mr. Davidge, and then we'll be done.
Thank you, Ron, I appreciate it. I've heard throughout this entire presentation, my fellow assembly members making comments, and I'm going to be just right out there. What we have been doing has been failing, right? So what happened down in downtown, where your location is, should never have happened, but it did. And you're right, we as a community, as a body, as a government, we failed. And so we're coming together now as a body and a community to make sure this doesn't happen again. But what I want to point out is that we have a plan that may or may not work, but we actually have a plan that better than I have ever been presented or seen, with projected numbers, with a facility that has actual treatment inside, not just random buildings that were bought and we put homeless our neighbors in and hide. So I think that's commendable with what's going on. But the point I wanted to bring was that when we say we don't want this happening anywhere else, our plan prior to the administration coming on was saying is that we were going to do the same thing. But instead of it being downtown, we were going to move our neighbors to other locations that were going to highly impact those neighborhoods.
Ms. Allard, did you have a question for Mr. Couples?
Yeah, so what I want to ask you is, do you believe that the plan that's coming forward is a good avenue to take? And are you, because I know you said you brought this up back in 2017, are you feeling positive about the plan coming forward?
Here's what I'll say. 4 years ago, I identified that property because I thought it made sense. Based on all the reasons that were in the slide, I supported it then, I support it now.
Thank you, Mr. Couples. Thank you, Ms. Allard. Mr. Davidge.
I'm here on for three organizations. As you know, president of the Midtown Community Council, Also founder and chairman of the Alaska Roundtable, which publishes the book. The new generation of the book will come out after the 4th of July. I wanted to see the presentation. And also as the founder and former chairman of the Alaska Veterans Foundation, which I retired from, and they moved to Fairbanks. I want to remind you of what we have done, and I was so happy to see the count. 0 veterans. For 20 years, we have been trying to solve veteran homelessness. It costs me 2 hours and less than $200 every time I engage. In 20 years, I've had 2 failures. Now, working with veterans is a little different than working with the general homeless community. But every one of those men and one woman are fully employed, totally taking care of themselves. Some have very, very good jobs, and we're able to crawl out of that hole. What did we do? What did we do? The first thing I did was confirm that they were a veteran. Unfortunately, most of them were not. I often get calls from the mayor's office, et cetera, like, get us homeless veteran down here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Almost all the time I find they're not veterans. It's very easy to find out with 3 questions. Secondly, I sit down and we have an hour to an hour and a half lunch because I want to get to know this person. Why are you here? Why are you homeless, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the course of that, you begin to see things that help you design your solution. The next thing I do, I put them at the bed prop in. I have a contract bed prop in. They're there for a week or 2 weeks. They feel good about that. First thing they have a warm and safe place to go. The next thing I do is I take them and sign them up to work with people living. I have 150 positions, spaces a year for people that are in contract for homeless veterans. Of course, I don't need 150. But they go to work, the next morning they get paid at night. They go to work, the next morning they get paid at night. In 3 days they have adequate cash flow to begin to take care of themselves. The next thing I do, if they don't have a phone, we go to the GCI and get a phone, $20. 2 hours, $200, no homeless veterans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davidge. Thank you to Marilyn Bronson and Dr. Morris for joining us today. Thank you to the members for all of your questions. We'll look forward to the follow-up on the written questions and additional questions asked today, and we'll keep this conversation going. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.